Welcome to this explainer. You know, we often picture the birth of a nation as this pure, unified moment of triumph, right? But, well, history is rarely that simple. Today, we're going to unpack the high hopes of Canada's 1867 Confederation and contrast them with the stark and honestly sometimes shocking realities that actually followed. We'll be diving straight into the historical sources and data to see what really happened after the ink dried on those Confederation documents. So, before we really get into the weeds, we've got to ask ourselves a massive fundamental question. Did Confederation actually benefit everyone, or did unity just mean inequality? Tying four incredibly distinct regions together under one dominion, that was an unprecedented constitutional experiment. The expectation was mutual prosperity for all. But we're going to look closely at whether creating a fair, equal nation was actually the reality on the ground. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit the Confederation question, look at central Canada's boom, and the contrasting maritime collapse. Then we'll dive into some deep social tensions, the wild Guibord Affair, and wrap up with the realities of a fragile union. Let's get to it. All right, Section 1, the Confederation question. We have to start with the massive constitutional shift that created an entirely new country out of distinct colonies. So, picture this. It's 1867. And Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick officially unite to form the Dominion of Canada. This union was a complete game changer because it gave the new Canadian government the unprecedented power to set national economic goals. The promise was essentially that a rising tide would lift all boats. New factories were popping up to produce everything from shoes and textiles to glass and furniture. The expectation was clear. This unified approach would bring wealth and stability to all four provinces. Moving right along to Section 2, Central Canada's boom. Because as we're about to see, that rising economic tide, it heavily favored the factories and businesses of Central Canada. Just look at these two images. They brilliantly illustrate the explosive growth of the era. The one on the left shows the Gooderham and Worts Distillery District in Toronto back in 1855, pre-Confederation. Looks quiet, almost sleepy, doesn't it? Now contrast that with the image on the right, painted in 1896, just 29 years later. It's completely transformed into this massive, smog-filled industrial powerhouse with sprawling railways, huge shipping ports, and towering smokestacks. The sheer scale of the expansion is just staggering. And what's truly mind-blowing here is the sheer volume of output they were generating. Small villages literally transformed into massive factory towns, almost overnight, pulling in thousands of people moving specifically just to find work. By 1871, that distillery district alone was shipping millions of gallons of products. And they weren't just supplying local towns. They were feeding a huge global market. They were sending goods across Quebec, out to the Maritimes, down to the United States, and incredibly, as far away as Brazil. Central Canada was absolutely experiencing an industrial golden age. Okay, let's shift gears to Section 3, the maritime collapse. This paints a very, very different reality for the east coast of this new country. This whole situation is summed up perfectly by a politician named J.C. Pope from Prince Edward Island back in 1879. He warned that Prime Minister Macdonald's national policy tariffs, which were basically taxes meant to make imported goods more expensive, would completely devastate the East. See, the Maritimes didn't have massive manufacturing hubs like Ontario. They relied heavily on international imports from the US, the Caribbean, and Asia. Pope hit the nail on the head when he pointed out that for these regions, the new nation just meant largely increased taxation with no corresponding advantages, noting they were paying 50% more in duties than before Confederation. Let's break down this heartbreaking domino effect on the screen right here. First up, those national policy tariffs made importing everyday goods incredibly expensive. Second, thanks to geography, high transport costs meant it was simply too pricey for maritime businesses to ship their own goods to the rest of Canada. Third, this led to overproduction. They were making way more than they could sell locally, resulting in fierce competition where they were ultimately just bought out by bigger competitors in Ontario and Quebec. The final effect, total industry collapse. Protective taxes meant to build a unified nation actually forced countless maritime families to abandon their homes and migrate to Western Canada or the US just to find a job. And you know, the data really doesn't lie. When we map out population growth between 1851 and 1901, you see a really sharp turning point. While the rest of Canada's population was spiking, driven by those booming factories in the center and migration out west, maritime population growth absolutely plummeted by the late 1880s. Their manufacturing collapsed, their economy flatlined, and their people were leaving.
It's a stark visual reminder of how unequal the economic benefits of Confederation truly were.
Which brings us to Section 4, deep social tensions. Because, as we're about to see, economics wasn't the only thing dividing this brand new nation. Bringing these incredibly diverse regions together was basically putting a lid on a pressure cooker of older, deep-rooted cultural tensions. On one side, you've got the majority in Ontario, largely English-speaking, mostly Protestant, and fiercely advocating for close ties with Britain. They kind of wanted English and Protestantism to be the standard for the whole country. On the flip side, you have Quebec, predominantly French-speaking, proudly Catholic, feeling very little connection to Britain and fiercely protective of their distinct cultural rights. Throwing them into a unified political system, it didn't erase these differences, it completely amplified them. And wow, did that pressure cooker explode during the Jubilee Riots of 1875? The Catholic Pope had declared 1875 a Jubilee year, so Catholics in Toronto organized a peaceful street procession. But the Protestant Orange Order, a really powerful group with heavy influence in politics and policing at the time, demanded the mayor cancel it. The Catholics refused, promising it would be a quiet celebration. Well, on October 3rd, violence erupted in the streets. Stones were thrown, pistol shots rang out, and it devolved into a chaotic 6-hour brawl. And what's even more shocking, many of the police officers assigned to protect the procession were actually members of the Orange Order themselves. The media reaction was fast and, frankly, pretty ominous. The Hamilton Times warned the very next day that, with a Protestant majority in Ontario and a Roman Catholic majority in Quebec, unless the majority in each protects the rights of the minority, an endless series of retaliatory acts will mark the future of the two provinces. That was a dire warning to the entire country. If you can't respect minority rights within your borders, this new Canadian project is just doomed to endless cycles of revenge. That leads us right into Section 5, the Guibord Affair. Because this religious tension didn't just stay in the streets. It went all the way up to the highest courts of the land. The saga of Joseph Guibord is, it's almost unbelievable. Step 1, he's denied a Catholic burial in 1869 because he belonged to a liberal group the church opposed. So his widow fought back for 5 long years. When the Supreme Court of Canada finally ruled in her favor, ordering that he had the right to be buried in his faith, an angry Catholic mob literally blocked the burial party. They were absolutely outraged that a secular court would dare overrule the church. When he was finally buried, it was only under a massive military guard, and get this, they actually had to pour cement over his casket to stop the mob from vandalizing it. Just take a second and imagine the scene in this image. November 16, 1875. It literally took 1,200 militiamen and soldiers to escort one man's casket to a cemetery. And even after the cement was poured, the local bishop immediately declared the ground around Guibord's grave to be no longer sacred. It really shows you just how far these conflicts escalated, completely blurring the lines between church, state, and the rule of law. The fallout from this was just monumental. In a massive move to protect its distinct culture and religious practices from outside interference, the Quebec government pushed back using its powers under Confederation. They passed a provincial law that completely bypassed the Supreme Court's influence on the matter, legally granting the Catholic Church absolute, sole authority to decide who could be buried in a Catholic cemetery. And what's truly wild is that this law, born out of the absolute chaos of the Guibord Affair, still exists today. It was a huge assertion of Quebec's independence within the unified country. And that brings us to our final section, Section 6, a fragile union. We've covered a lot of ground today, so what can we actually take away from this turbulent era of early Canadian history? So what are our main takeaways here? Well, yes, Confederation absolutely brought national economic power and a unified voice. But the reality? It was highly skewed. Central Canada industrialized, hoarded wealth, and boomed into a modern manufacturing hub. Meanwhile, the Maritimes faced a severe economic collapse, skyrocketing costs, and devastating outmigration. Culturally, the Union forced intense Protestant and Catholic clashes right out into the open, resulting in street violence like the Jubilee Riots and massive legal standoffs like the Guibord Affair. It required deep, uneasy legal compromises just to maintain the peace. The reality of Confederation was an incredibly delicate balancing act of economic winners and losers, held together by sheer willpower. Which leaves us with one final, lingering question to ponder. When a nation is built on such deep compromises, who actually pays the price? As we've seen from the historical data and these incredible stories today, unity on paper does not automatically mean equality in practice. History is all about looking past those grand expectations to really understand the gritty, complex reality of the folks who actually lived through it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking those big questions.